They fucking ate guys sometimes. We'll get into it. Let's not sensationalize, but they ate people sometimes, and you know what? You know what? Maybe they taste good. I don't know. Do you know?
Hello, my members of the no-fly list. I'm happy to say I got off that damn island I was stranded on, and have made my way safely to shore by using Narvaez's body as a raft and occasional snack. Where am I now? Well, that's a great question. I have no idea.
You are aware that I can access the internet, correct? You could not only discover your location, but also call for help.
Internet?
It's that thing you use to access pornography.
Oh, yes, that. Well, I have been calling for help. The horny housewives in my area are on their way.
Those are swarthy Turkish men looking to steal your credit card information.
As long as they're horny, I don't care. This is the sixth entry, maybe? I don't know, in my series following Spanish expeditions in the New World. But I can provide a quick recap here, if you're too busy to go watch hours upon hours of high-quality, unhinged ramblings. You have horny Turkish men to pleasure. I understand. We're gonna keep it brief. A bunch of dumbasses are stranded on a beach in Texas, far from Spanish civilization. One of those dumbasses, Cabeza de Vaca, yes, I know his name means head of a cow, there's a reason for that, we don't have time, would go on to write a Relacion covering the events. This Relacion is a unique and one-of-a-kind window into the previously uncontacted Native Americans of the Texas and northeastern Mexican coast, as Cowhead would live among them for nearly a decade. I like to think of it as a little bit of accidental anthropology. Through his eyes, we see Native Americans. We see them not as victims of disease, cruelty, nor exploitation, but rather as people, living, fighting, loving, and mourning, in a world that was not new, but was very, very old. Most interestingly, this disastrous expedition would inspire two others, which we will cover later. What unites all three of them is a simple fact. The first people to write about North America were Spaniards. Thomas Jefferson himself would say as much, and that Spanish was an important language for an American to learn. I disagree, however, because I am racist.
Spanish is a European language, you absolute fool.
Europeans are subhuman. I measured their skulls. Anyway, let us return to the adventures of Cabeza de Vaca and his shipwrecked peers. After this sponsor, their emails still reach me out here somehow, and I simply must pay tribute to Lord Balthamazos, the Dick Ripper. This video is sponsored by War Thunder. What, War Thunder? You haven't heard of War Thunder? War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. You can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships. No, it won't bring your dad back, but you will become a man in War Thunder, baptized in the crucible of conflict itself, so that your cool new dad, Derek, will finally respect you. You know what War Thunder is. The graphics, realistic. The vehicles, detailed. The sound effects, authentic. The game, free. Your grandfather had to lie about his age to feel the glorious shrapnel shred his flesh. But all you need to do is click my link in the description to join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today. Look at these gorgeously detailed X-ray kill cams. Do you realize how many times you can watch yourself die for free? You can play casual arcade matches, hardcore simulation games, and even the hyper-advanced realistic battles where after every gloriously detailed X-ray death, you are forced to watch a 10-minute cutscene of your newly widowed wife crying. With an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, there's simply no game better suited for fans of military history. You can play on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. If you click on my link in the description or pinned comment, you'll get the massive bonus pack. Available for both new and returning players that haven't played for at least 6 months. This bonus is available for a limited time only. Thank you, War Thunder, for sponsoring this video. Cabeza, I got good news. Well, that last title card makes me doubt that, but okay, go ahead. Well, I climbed a tree nearby, and I've got some intel. First of all, I can't see any of the other rafts, and we're on an island. Oh, so we're both totally alone, and have to get in that fucking water again. Okay, I probably shouldn't have started with that. But it doesn't matter. I saw a bunch of trails, and they looked like cattle trails. I think that Christians might live here. Thank God. Okay, follow one of the trails. Oviedo. Just don't go too far. Okay, so I've got some more good news and some bad news. I didn't find any Christians, but I found a small barking rodent, and a bucket of fish, and 100 Native American warriors. Yes. With only 40 men with him, and even fewer able to fight, Cabeza attempted to communicate with the natives, and the Spanish managed to establish friendly relations for once. So the natives would return to the beach once a day for several days, bringing food and at times even women and children to gawk at the emaciated and strange outsiders. At this point, with their strength regained, and fearful that the natives may turn on them at any moment, the men dug the raft out of the sand, pushed it out to sea, and jumped on it, right before a massive wave broke the raft, and whatever remained of these men's belief in a benevolent God. They didn't have a raft. They didn't even have clothes anymore, as they'd removed them to keep them dry on the raft as they pushed it. They were now naked in a new world, and totally at the mercy of the natives as winter began to set in. The men, half-drowned, naked, and shivering, returned to their campsite, huddled around the last embers of their fire, and cried. They cried for nearly an hour, begging Christ to help them. And when the natives came with food, they joined them, and so, Spaniard and native alike wept around the fire. Cabeza de Vaca begged for shelter for himself and his men, and the natives acquiesced, even going so far as to build a trail of huge bonfires between the beach and their village, so the strange outsiders would have a chance to warm themselves on their journey. The Spanish had no recourse: live among the natives or die on a cold beach. 5 of them chose to die on the beach, but we'll get back to them. What the fuck are you holding? Oh, some white guys gave this to me. I got some potato salads, some Star Wars fun facts, some YouTube video essays, white guy stuff. We lost all our stuff on the raft. Did you find this on the shore? Oh no, they're other white guys. What? Cabeza's raft was not the only one which washed up on Galveston Island in Texas, and the two groups reunited joyously. They tried to raft again, but
You can guess what fucking happened. Do I need to tell you what fucking happened? The ocean did not like these men!
at this point, it's time to discuss just who these natives were. As much of the rest of this video will be spent learning about the natives of Texas and northeastern Mexico, who these Spanish were the first Europeans to meet. Galveston Island was inhabited during the winter by 2 different bands of the Karankawa group, the Capokis and the Hans. Cabeza de Vaca never notes which exactly took him in. Let's clear up some terminology here, at least as best we can. The nomadic hunter-gatherers of Texas were messy. With no real political organization, it was all fluid, so we have to discuss them in a way in which they'd never discuss themselves. We're going to use 2 terms. Bands, which were coalitions of around 20 to 100 people who lived and hunted and traveled together, and groups, which consisted of mini-bands, which, for anthropological purposes, have been grouped together by cultural, language, and geographic similarities. But enough of that. What were these people like? The daughter of a captain in the American Navy would try to preserve their language. According to her, they spoke their sentences in one breath without looking at the other party, and followed each sentence with an exhale, which led them to seem surly and depressed. Okay, so do you use your environment in novel and interesting ways? We make an oil from sharks, which repels mosquitoes or whatever. Furthermore, the men pierced one nipple. Also, when a child died, they entered a period of mourning. Yes, they, the whole band. The parents would cry every morning, then the rest of the band would join them for the morning cry circle for a year. This ended on the first anniversary of the death of the child, at which point they'd do what they did for every fallen member of the band, which was get all painted up and party. Cabeza wrote something funny about that, actually.
They mourn all their dead in this manner, except old people to whom they do not pay any attention.
Each man had one wife, except for medicine men, who got 2 or 3. The mother and father of the bride were not allowed in the home of the husband, insert boomer joke here, and upon the death of a husband, the widow and children would not go in search of food for months. And to be clear, these were hunter-gatherers, no farming at all, so that was basically all they did. Rather, the entire band would bring their own food and share. So it seems to have served as both a time for mourning and also a time for the community to come together. So that's nice. What a nice tribe of people! They ate people!
This would all go a lot easier if you approach the subject with an open mind and an eagerness to learn.
You heard it here first. Computer is okay with eating people because he's a liberal.
To quote from the Karankawa Indians, the Coast People of Texas by Albert S. Gatchett, The authentic and documentary proofs that all the original Texan tribes were man-eaters are too numerous to permit any doubt of this fact. Ethnologists who through false philanthropy revoke in doubt the historic statements which prove the fact have never been able to controvert these testimonies. They have only shown thereby their inability to place themselves into the state of mind of an Aboriginal American savage.
What does that mean? I have zero reading comprehension.
This 19th century historian is saying that the natives of Texas absolutely ate people because everyone said so, and anyone that says otherwise is a libtard.
I see. That being said, this 19th century historian, we can safely assume, is wrong. The very first European to ever write about the Karankawa recorded their absolute horror and anger at cannibalism because, as the winter set in, the 5 Spaniards who elected to remain on the beach, out of fear that they'd be sacrificed or eaten by their native hosts, started eating each other. And the Karankawa naturally said to Cabeza and the others staying with him, "What the fuck is wrong with you people? Are you gonna eat us? You fucking lunatics?" So you see, the Karankawa weren't cannibals, but the Spanish were.
Could it be that you are oversimplifying? You do certainly have a tendency towards hyperbole for the sake of drama.
Nope. The natives of the Texas coast lived in a glorious, untouched utopia, and if you ever criticize me again, I'll kill myself.
The Karankawa of Texas as a culture are now extinct, although some mixed descendants do survive. Their supposed cannibalism was used as justification for their horrifying genocide. As a consequence, modern-day historians almost totally reject the notion, partially due to their understandable aversion to truly despicable racist rhetoric. But the story of these people was not recorded exclusively by their enemies, as we have at hand the incredible account of Cabeza de Vaca and another fascinating source. After the raiding of a French fort in 1688, the Karankawa would adopt the French children there, and among them was a child named Jean-Baptiste Talon. Jean-Baptiste would live among them for 3 years, and would generally describe them fondly. In fact, from his account and Cabeza's, we can see the Karankawa, even more so than most humans, doted on their children and cared for them deeply. Nonetheless, Jean-Baptiste, in a later testimony to French authorities, would describe ritualized cannibalism. This cannibalism was consistent with other accounts of cannibalism perpetrated by the Karankawa's neighbors, the Tonkawa.
Did they eat the French? How did they get past the smell?
No, they did not consume the flesh of the French, despite the French having opened hostilities with them. We could speculate as to why, but Timothy F. Sighter presented an excellent dissection of this practice in his paper, Karankawas, Re-examining Texas Gulf Coast Cannibalism, which is serving as our main source on this phenomenon, as it's a subject few modern academics tackle in good faith. In it, Sighter states, quote, "With the consumption of flesh damning an enemy for eternity, this act was reasonably reserved for longtime foes and is the greatest sign of disrespect, not practiced on temporary enemies. The Karankawas, residing on their land for centuries, had plenty of time to develop ancient enemies. The French, residing on the land for roughly 4 years, constituted a fickle and clearly inexperienced dance partner. There is a difference between consuming the flesh of your fallen foe ritualistically and consuming the flesh of your comrades out of desperation. Regardless, from the Karankawa perspective, the Spanish had treated the flesh of their brothers as animal flesh, a disrespect of the highest order which prevented them from a happy afterlife. To say the Karankawa were not cannibals based on this single event is to remove nuance. It is to regard all cannibalism as equal, an idea as foolish as regarding all violence as equal. It is the equivalent of claiming that the Spanish were never violent because they regarded murder as a sin.
So, did they eat people or not?
They ate the bodies of fallen ancient enemies, and we have no first-hand reliable account of them doing so to Europeans, although that may have occurred at some point. The Karankawa would often trade with European settlers and Spanish missionaries. One settler even had Karankawa teach his young daughter how to swim. But Karankawa cannibalism, despite being a rare and ritualistic act which was not applied wantonly, would be used to justify their extermination and would define their legacy. Countless reports from settlers would embellish the act, making the Karankawa out to be not only cannibals but outright beasts in human skin. We should always be cautious in our application of European sources, But our two most in-depth overviews of life among the Karankawa demonstrate a complex attitude towards cannibalism. Even Cabeza's account, which is often used to refute accusations of cannibalism itself, contains cannibalism. As the Karankawa drank the ash left from burning a medicine man's bones. The Karankawa were not noble savages in a native utopia, nor inhuman barbaric animals. They loved their friends and family, and they were cruel to their foes. They were, in short, human.
So, they did eat people.
Well, yes, but...
Wow, computer, that's pretty fucking racist. Anyway, the situation grew worse once many in the tribe began dying of a bowel disease, most likely dysentery. They came very close to killing these strange white men, but in the end, they spared them, reasoning that if these men had the ability to magically curse people, then they probably would not be so fucking useless. By the end of the winter, 15 Spaniards remained, and they had become slaves, relegated to the woman's work of digging up roots and carrying wood. Cabeza de Vaca's grandfather was a war hero who had led the conquest of the Canary Islands. De Vaca himself had been appointed as the man in charge of ensuring the king gets all the gold he's due, a position, as I'm sure you could imagine, of great power and privilege. And now, his hands bled as he dug roots from frozen soil. His naked back scraped and splintered against bark as he carried firewood, and the children of the tribe pulled at his strange beard and laughed in his face. Cabeza and his comrades were so disrespected, so utterly useless, that you're a bunch of freeloaders, you know that? It's time for you to really begin pulling your weight, since you can't even dig for fucking roots right. We need you to heal this sick man. I did not go to medical school. Medicine is the easiest bitch work we could find, and you can't even do that properly. Just go breathe on them. That's what you think medicine is? Oh god, you're not one of those anti-breathers, are you? The science is settled. It will not give him demon penis. That's Apache misinformation. The Spanish struggled to do the complicated medical procedure of cut them a few times, then breathe on them until they die, so the natives even began to withhold food until they did it properly. As the seasons changed, the Spanish found themselves divided among different nomadic bands of the Karankawa people, and Cabeza ended up alone. During this time, he learned of 13 Spaniards trying to make their way home on foot, but Cabeza was so ill at the time that he couldn't even entertain the idea of finding them and joining them. Cabeza would spend a year with this band, doing aforementioned bitch work, before escaping to another Karankawa band, where he hoped to find better treatment. Now, let me tell you, you can take the European out of Europe, but you can't take the Europe out of a European. Not without extensive experimental surgery the FDA won't let me do anyway. Because Cabeza became a traveling merchant. Taking goods from one place to another, he managed to do quite well, making deals with the many bands in the area, with his #abundance grindset. It is thanks to Cabeza's primitive dropshipping empire that we now have a merchant's guide to hunter-gatherer Texas. If you want to make it big in this tribal economy, you gotta take shells from the shore and trade them inland for deerskin and red dirt, which is, apparently, the height of fashion when it comes to celebrations. A great video by a YouTuber called Ancient Americas brought my attention to this little burial in Cahokia, where some bigwig was buried with a bunch of shells, as well as just myriad beads. By the way, I don't just watch YouTube videos for research, it was just for fun. Read this book, though, it's really good. But don't, because I'm gonna make a video on it. Cabeza says that no one else in the parts that he was in did the traveling merchant thing, so he introduced the concept to the natives. But Cahokia, which to be clear was like the biggest Mississippian society city, had been gone for centuries by this point. So clearly, it had been happening, at least on the Mississippi. For a time, Cabeza did quite well for himself, establishing relations with the different tribes and gaining knowledge of the land and its inhabitants. He did this for 6 years. Would home begin to feel like a dream for you? Some wavering unreality that existed just over the horizon, as Cabeza slept alone in his travels with deerskins stuffed with shells or dirt. He never stopped wanting to return there. Only one thing was keeping him: Lope de Oviedo, the very man who had climbed the tree on Galveston, was still with the band which had found him, and Cabeza would return once a year on his travels, begging Lope to join him. Lope would, after much convincing, joined Cabeza as he made his journey home. And so, they began traveling southwest. And on their way, they came across a small group of natives who said they knew what happened to the Spanish that had left years earlier while Cabeza was sick. They're dead. I want to go back home. Don't let these guys scare you. Yeah, don't let us scare you. You should do what your other friends did, which was ignore us. And now they're dead. Come on, they can't all have died. How could you even know? Did you kill them yourselves? What? Of course not. That's a waste of arrows right there. Who would give a shit about those guys? Did you see their root digging? Shoddy work, to be honest. No, they all got killed by these guys, the Coahuilteco. That's an anachronistic thing to say. Shut up. But last we heard, they did have 3 enslaved Spaniards. So, they're not dead, then. The guys they're with, they might as well be. I'm going home. We are going home, Lope. Come on, what are you gonna do? You're just gonna go dig roots and sleep outside for the rest of your goddamn life? Yeah, I think I am going to go do that. Goodbye, Cabeza. I hope you find home. And that was the last the history books would ever record of Lope de Oviedo. When the rafts landed on the coast of Texas, a pattern began playing out. Those that attempted to integrate with the natives lived, and those who refused or were unable to died, and were apparently delicious. We are not dealing with the complex city-state politics of Mesoamerica, and even the subsistence agricultural villages of Florida. The Karankawa were fully nomadic hunter-gatherers. Where they were at any given time of year was determined by where the food was, and whatever that food was would serve as basically their entire diet for that time. Are you like me? Do you think oysters are disgusting sea snot that are slurped out of still living rocks? Well, that sucks for you, because the early months of spring was spent on the mainland, eating almost exclusively oysters, so naturally it would be difficult for Cabeza de Vaca to find the other surviving Spaniards. However, thankfully for Cabeza, pecans are delicious. Blooming once every 2 years, large groves of pecan trees attracted many of the local natives to this area of the Guadalupe River during this time. The bands that were attracted, however, were not just Karankawa. So the Iguaces band, who had 1 Spaniard and 1 African slave, named Castillo and Estebanico respectively, along with the Miriames band, who had 1 Spaniard named Dorantes, and the Cuevenes band, who now had Cabeza, were all there at the same time. The men reunited in this moment, far luckier than they could have imagined, and planned their escape. Cabeza would join with Dorantes in the Miriames band, so that in 6 months, when both bands were south eating the prickly pear cactus fruit while it was in season, they could all escape together through the dense cactus foliage. There are a few things of note during this time. Estebanico, as I said, was an African slave, and Dorantes was his former master. They didn't even live in the same band, and I really think it's hard to order your slave around when, you're enslaved. As Andres Resendez points out, it seems like it was a pretty egalitarian situation for all of them at this point. Interestingly, these men were the first Europeans to see buffalo. But let's dig into these people Cabeza is with. The Native American group which inhabited this area of modern-day Texas and Mexico were called the Coahuilteco. So what was life like living among them? Well, this is for all of you persistence hunting fans in the Cobbler fanbase. Yes, I know, all 2 of you. The Miriames would run deer to death. This tribe would also do controlled wildfires, so as to drive deer and other game into their preferred hunting grounds. This is notable, as we tend to imagine hunter-gatherer Native Americans living in pristine, untouched nature. The book 1491 by Charles Mann is a great book on this topic if you'd like to learn more. Regardless, Cabeza describes the Coahuilteco as what I could only describe as gangs of Mad Max desert lunatics. The Coahuilteco would crush the bones of animals they ate into a fine powder, which they would also eat. They were also pretty based and red-pilled and didn't buy that feminist garbage because they left their infant girls in the element to be eaten by coyotes. Wow, it's beginning to sound like Cabeza de Vaca may have really disliked these guys and perhaps even made up some shit to make them sound like absolute savage bastard animal men. I should say that only the bands that the Spaniards were with had this practice. I like to imagine the rest of the Coahuilteco regarded these guys as lunatics too. We're speaking about a very broad area here, keep that in mind. The men they were with would force Cabeza and Dorantes to spend their nights keeping a smoky bonfire going in the middle of the camp to drive mosquitoes away. If the men failed in this duty, which is to say, fell asleep during night, they'd be awoken with a cruel beating. The Coahuilteco lived in a rough environment. Due to the lack of fresh water near the coast, the Coahuilteco lacked access to oyster month and the many other bounties of the sea the Karankawa enjoyed.
I believe assuredly that if in that land there were stones, they would eat them.
He even wrote that they would eat deer shit, which I seriously doubted. But then I found out that Bedouin nomads ate camel shit to treat dysentery. Maybe there was a medicinal thing at play here, which Cabeza just didn't understand. But Bedouin nomads only ate fresh camel shit. There's no way the Coahuilteco were getting hot, steaming deer shit. So, I don't know. Take it as you will. Regardless, after 6 months of desert fun with this impressive and industrious Mad Max gang of fucking lunatics, the Spanish found themselves reunited during prickly pear season. Everything was arranged and ready to go when... Are you looking at my girl, bro? Yeah, 'cause I'm hungry, and she looks like shit. The Coahuilteco began fighting over a woman, even going so far as to beat the shit out of each other with branches. They would all end up getting so mad they'd storm off in different directions, taking their slaves with them, which divided the men once more. So, one more year of this horrible, horrible nightmare, that's fun. The 4 men convened in the prickly pear fields again the following year, and made their escape. And then, at the end of 6 years of enslavement, of sleeping in the cold, of beatings and confusion and cannibalism and fear, something incredible happened. These strange-looking men from a faraway land on the other side of the sea developed a reputation as healers. Doing much what they had done years ago on Galveston, the men would do some crosses and some prayers over sick natives, and they would rise again, healthy. As word of their deeds spread, they would amass a veritable army of followers as they made their way across northern Mexico performing miracles. Here's what Andres Resendez said on this.
Today we live in a more skeptical age. We seek out alternative explanations for these healings, such as the power of suggestion, exaggeration on the part of Spaniards' accounts, or even deceit by the Indians. But there is no more evidence to support those explanations than there is to support the faith of both the castaways and the natives in supernatural intervention. All we can say with confidence is that this gift of curing, whether real or imagined, allowed the castaways to move forwards toward their deliverance.
The men moved inland, where they found some evidence of settled civilization, like corn, copper bells, and something quite a bit darker. These men and their Indian followers began coming across abandoned cities. A dark truth began to sink in. As the men had been making their way back to Spanish civilization had been making its way to them. There's no way that happened. There is no goddamn way that 3 Spaniards and an African slave managed to amass hundreds of Native American followers due to their miraculous healing powers. Here's the thing. They did. I went from not buying it at all to believing it absolutely. I need you to understand why I, at the beginning, just did not buy it. You may have noticed a small yellow square on the map I've been using, and that yellow square belonged to Nuño de Guzman. He is sometimes referred to as Bloody Guzman. Checking Cortez's growing power seemed to have been a significant concern of Charles V in the latter half of the 1520s, with Narvaez and Guzman both being attempts to halt his territory's growth to the north. Appointed as the governor of Panuco in 1525, Guzman would find the area settled and exploited by supporters of Cortez once he finally made it there in 1527. Shockingly, Bloody Guzman treated this problem with a real lack of tact and grace, as he put many of these men on trial and executed executed them. He then proceeded on to Mexico City, where he would help conduct a very aggressive investigation of Cortez. He would only hold the position briefly, however, because, well, this might shock you, the guy sort of had a habit of making enemies. And so, in 1529, he, well, pulled to Cortez by ignoring the law and taking 400 Spaniards and 12,000 natives north in a notoriously brutal war of conquest. This was the territory promised to Narvaez, but him being presumed dead opened it up to Guzman's ambitious grasp. Everybody hated this guy. Bleeding Heart Native American advocate Bartolomé de las Casas and conqueror of the Aztecs who had a harem of native sex slaves, Hernan Cortez, both hated his guts. That's sort of impressive. I mean, just look at the mustache I put on him. What a dick. Among the many terrible things Guzman did was make money on illegal slaving raids. Mounted conquistadors could easily run down and capture countless natives in the northern frontier, and this would prove to be wildly profitable. Guzman was the reason Cabeza de Vaca and his peers found empty cities at the end of their odyssey. They'd been abandoned, as the citizens of the cities fled into the mountains to escape bloody Guzman's men. By April 1536, the natives had long ago learned to fear the armored horsemen, so it immediately got the slavers' attention when some began approaching them directly. Their confusion only increased once they saw 3 of the natives were white, save for a single one who was dark as an African. Cabeza spoke first, but the slavers were so dumbfounded they could only stare in shock at the 4 sunburned survivors of the Narvaez expedition, and the 600 natives that followed them. Natives who, through Cabeza and his peers' miracles, had been convinced to resettle and cultivate these lands. In the name of Jesus Christ our Lord and Savior, Amen. You may be beginning to see my issue. Cabeza's account has him as the humble barefoot conquistador, God's chosen instrument of healing, in contrast to the friendless, power-hungry, and vile Guzman. In fact, those slavers, surprise, surprise, would divide the survivors of the expedition from their native followers. And they did that thing that slavers do. Cabeza de Vaca was trying to secure an adelantado from Charles, a license to conquer and colonize, and his Relacion is a hell of a job application. While his Relacion, in the form which survives today, was published later, he and his peers would all submit this story in a joint report in Mexico City. As I said, I have come to believe this story, at least to some extent. The survivors of the expedition did amass a group of Native American followers and acted as healers among them. But for now, let's discuss how Cabeza's story affected the growing Spanish Empire's politics. Was the conquest of Mexico justified? Yes, the topic that annoying culture war memes deal with today was a question in the decades after it occurred. Was a military conquest against people who had literally done nothing to Spain justified? Sure, they're not Christian, but they didn't choose to ignore Jesus like those godless Muslims. No one had ever told them about Jesus, and, maybe we're not making a good first impression, but could we teach them about Jesus without killing them all first? What if they just said, no, fuck off? Aforementioned bleeding heart humanitarian, Bartolomé de las Casas, found in Cabeza de Vaca's story the sort of argument he'd been looking for. Cabeza de Vaca's account showed a population of people with certainly, barbaric practices, but many which the Spanish would find laudable as well. Notably, there was no human sacrifice in Cabeza's account. They cared deeply for their children. They did convert, peacefully, once confronted with a miracle of God and without being forced to. And according to Cabeza, some of them already worshipped a lord of all creation who they said lived in the sky. Bartolomé de las Casas, in his constant petitions with the king and his constant legal battles for the rights of Native Americans, fought for a world of peaceful conversion. And in Cabeza's story, he found the evidence he was looking for to support this vision of the future. Now, I can't find anyone making this specific claim, but it seems natural to me that Cabeza's story must have had some role in the passing of the new laws of 1542, which Las Casas supported and which ended the encomienda system and the forced labor of Native Americans. Native Americans were to be treated as full citizens of the Spanish Empire. That's nice, right? A little human rights victory before such a term even existed. Anyway, these laws did not last. A civil war broke out over them before being swiftly put down, and this scared Charles enough for him to repeal the most important of the laws. Bartolomé de las Casas's writing and political activism would be suppressed after his death. Writing on the conquest of Mexico itself would be restricted by the Crown in time as well. The question of whether or not the mistreatment and forced labor of Native Americans was just would fade into the background, as Aztec gold, and to a greater extent, Peruvian silver, funded Spain's ascension to global empire. When we look at the story of Cabeza de Vaca and the failed expedition of Narvaez, we see a story which not only grabs our imagination now, but one which even grabbed imaginations at the time. A story which would, if only briefly, and certainly only slightly, influence the rights of Native Americans in the Spanish New World. In the ongoing arguments about the conquest of Mexico, the big question was always whether or not military force was required to spread Christianity. Cabeza de Vaca's story was used by Las Casas to argue that a spiritual conquest, without a military conquest, was not only possible, but preferable.
Both Cabeza de Vaca's knowledge, based on first-hand observation, and his experience of peaceful colonization made him an exemplar of Las Casas's ideals. The information provided by Cabeza de Vaca's interpretation of his experience with the natives became for Las Casas not only eyewitness testimony, but also moral authority, which he put to the service of his own far-reaching philosophical arguments.
That's what Cabeza de Vaca's story did. What convinced me that the story actually happened at all? Well, a more close reading for one. Once I indulged my autism and got a second translation with a way better introduction, don't buy the Penguin Classics translation. Cabeza and the two other Spaniards who were there all had the same story, submitted in a joint report made in Mexico City, which is now, you guessed it, lost to the ravages of time, but appears to have contained the same story. Estebanico, as a slave, was not asked for his testimony. There's no way, nor possibility really, that he would have colluded with some sort of lie on Cabeza de Vaca's behalf. He returned to a life of servitude under Dorantes, before being purchased by the Viceroy of New Spain for a little venture, a new expedition north. It would not go well. Regardless, Estebanico would be used as a diplomat in this expedition. Per other sources in the expedition, he would dress and behave as he had with Cabeza years prior. This worked out very well for him. At first, "Greetings, O Dark One. Please accept as tribute for your services this pile of booze and babes." Holy shit. Things would go south as they moved north, however. As Estebanico moved ahead of the expedition, he would eventually be slain by the natives they came across. As to why, well, there's a lot of speculation, but what matters to me is that Estebanico played the role that he had with Cabeza and the others, comfortably and to great success, in northern Mexico. For a time, a shipwrecked slave became a god. Cabeza de Vaca, by all appearances, considered himself enlightened from his odyssey. He would be granted an adelantado at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata, rather than Florida, which he had hoped for. He would travel barefoot rather than mounted, and imposed strict rules on the conduct of conquistadors beneath him, until the mutiny. Much as the new laws of 1542 would be rebelled against, so too was Cabeza himself. He was sent back to Spain on a series of trumped-up and probably false charges, including delivering bodies to be eaten by the natives. He was put on trial in Spain and convicted. He would later get his sentence reduced, but that was the end of Cabeza de Vaca's adventures. We don't know exactly when he died, but we do know that he died an old man in his ancestral village. A new world had dawned, and it had no place in it for a barefoot conquistador. And those stories he had about a miracle in the desert. Thanks for watching. Once again, this video was sponsored by War Thunder. Be sure to click my link in the description to check it out and get all the bonuses you can see here. Thanks War Thunder for sponsoring this video. I've listed out some sources in the description too. I'm about to move across the country and I'm beginning to feel that this format's a little too restrictive. So expect some things to change here soon, but regardless, thanks for your patience. Thanks for watching.